everyone, it's Andrew. So this is going to be a video about the book called Ender's Shadow by Orson Scott Card. Many of you know this already, but this book is the first book of the Shadows Quartet, which is on my left here. This is the second kind of quartet books of Orson Scott Card in the Ender series. And this kind of starts off a series of books that kind of go over Bean and things like that. But a little bit background, I read Ender's Game probably about like 10 years ago or so. Read it, really liked the book at that time, but then over the past about year I kind of revisited the Orson Scott Card series with the Ender series and started reading the books chronologically. And so over the past year I've read essentially the Ender's quartet books, which include Speaker for the Dead, Xenocide, and Children of the Mind. And kind of I'm not going to go into too much detail about those books, but in those books, after Ender's Game, it essentially goes off into this kind of like parallel, like later time period where he's kind of searching for placing the Bugger Queen on a different planet, and he essentially discovers this planet with these piggies that are kind of this morphed like pig human kind of combination, and it goes into kind of the series, like a whole storyline related to that. Overall, it's interesting and it's useful to read and stuff like that, but I found the books were kind of boring to a certain extent and not as exciting as Ender's Game in general. And so I read all those books, and I recently came back to Ender's Shadow, and it was a really nice, refreshing update, kind of on the Ender's Game kind of time period. So that's why I wanted to do this review. So sorry for the long introduction, but so Ender's Shadow in general, it starts back at the time period of Ender's Game, and so it kind of follows the time period of the Battle School. But during this book, it really focuses on the parallel story for Bean, who Bean isn't a huge like character in the first book from like Ender's Game, from what I recall reading it a long time ago. I haven't read it recently, but the nice part is that Bean was essentially like a parallel like person that could have been the commander for the fleet if they chose to do that. And so in this book, it essentially starts off with Bean, his backstory of how he was raised, where he grew up. So he grew up on the streets of Rotterdam as like an orphan. Initially, he's probably like 2 or 3 years old, but he's got unparalleled intelligence, and so he's very small for his size, like age at that time period. And so he has to survive on the streets by obtaining food and things like that, by kind of like working in gangs of children to obtain food from like local food kitchens and things like that. So from there, it kind of goes into that story, and then essentially in those gangs, he has to like compete with these bullies that run the gangs and use his intelligence to kind of subvert them and get what he wants. And so eventually he comes from like a kind of minor gang and then becomes part of a gang that's ran by this kid named Achilles, who has like a gimp in his leg, that ultimately can allow him to obtain like unwanted, like unsurmountable food and things like that. At the same time, what happens is there's a nun called Sister Carletta, who is a kind of spokesperson that searches for the fleet to find children that are qualified for Battle School. And so she comes across this gang and what's going on in Rotterdam, and kind of tries to figure out what's going on with these gangs and why they're becoming successful and things like that. And so she comes across Achilles and thinks he's a good candidate for Battle School, but then she ultimately finds out that really Bean's the brains behind the operation. And so she like educates the kids at a time, sees if they're qualified for that, and Bean essentially takes this test like haphazardly, like tired and not really caring about it, and scores extremely high, which puts him to Battle School. And you already know he's at Battle School, so that's how he ultimately got to Battle School. Once at Battle School, it's very interesting because unlike for Ender, Bean really focuses on Ender being so successful and why he's famous really from the beginning. So he tries to figure out why Ender is so successful and famous and like being so successful at the school. And so he focuses a lot on like what the background Ender is, trying to kind of mirror that in what he's doing, and then he also does a lot of research on other students to be successful. But he's so intelligent that he just can't socialize with other students at the school like Ender does, and he doesn't get their confidence from them as far as becoming a commander as easily as Ender does. Additionally, in this book, it's really interesting because they go kind of into the backstory of Bean and his background of why he's so intelligent. I'm not going to comment on that because I don't want to spoil that aspect of the book, but they go into that at one point, which is really, it's like an offshoot, but it's really interesting from that standpoint. Once in battle school, though, as you know, he kind of joins Dragon Army eventually, and then goes on to kind of become part of commanding the fleet. And that's all I'm going to kind of allude to at this time, because I don't want to spoil it further for you. But in general, my impression of the book is, especially because I came back to this book later on, like I read Ender's Game so long ago, coming back to the time period of battle school with Ender's Game and kind of while Ender's there, this was a very refreshing update after reading kind of the rest of Ender's Quartet, where it offshoots the other direction. So it's a really useful way to revisit that time, revisit the book in a separate manner. And Orson Scott Card does a really good job of kind of not really repeating all the topics he went over in Ender's Game. So it is a very interesting book, standing kind of separate from Ender's Game. Like the fact that he wrote two books that are parallel at the same time period, two separate characters, but not overlapping those stories a lot, it makes it for an interesting read. So I really like this book a lot from that standpoint. Additionally, I think that I don't remember what I was going to say. In general, my advice is, I'm reading the books chronologically. I haven't read them before, but I would generally recommend that for others who are starting to go into like Ender's Game and reading the books beyond that. The reason why is because even though these other books like Xenocide, Children of Mine, and Speaker for the Dead offshoot, they do discuss certain topics in those books that when you come back to here with Ender's Shadow, they kind of give you a gist of like, you need to know that information kind of moving forwards. And so there's certain things that he discusses in other books that just comes back in this book that in this book he just haphazardly remarks it, but in the other books they kind of go into it in a lot of detail and things like that. And that's specifically for like the political aspect. And there's Locke and I don't remember, Demosthenes, I don't remember her name, sorry, but they're essentially characters that are very important as far as the political structure of things, and they comment a lot more in the other books about that. But meanwhile in Ender's Shadow he just kind of glances over really quickly, and it's not as interesting as far as the story related to that. Additionally, I would say that like reading in sequence, I think it's important chronologically, because in this book, when he discusses the stories with Bean and kind of the backstory with that, he kind of assumes you've read Ender's Game. So no matter what, I think you have to read Ender's Game first, just to get that backstory. And then you could potentially read this book in sequence kind of at the same time. But I don't think it's as useful as far as reading that. I think there could be some drawbacks if you haven't read the whole line. So that's my general recommendation, is do kind of what I'm doing, is reading chronologically and then move from there. But from my understanding is kind of once you get past Ender's Game, reading like these books don't matter as much. So you could potentially come back and read Ender's Shadow second, and then kind of go down this route and think about it more chronologically and like the storyline and read it that way. But that's currently what I'm not doing. My next steps are I'm going to read the rest of Shadow's Quartet, and he just released the final book in this series. I don't know if I'll necessarily come back to that, reading that book immediately, or I'm going to read the rest of kind of like the Hageman and like all those sorts of stories as well. But in general, I don't want to talk too much longer, but Ender's Shadow, it's a great book. It gives the story about Bean. It's definitely parallel to the time of Ender's Game and the time period of Battle School, and it gives you a lot of insight into Bean, the character development there, his background, and kind of why he's so successful, and kind of the drawbacks or character flaws that he has that doesn't make him as good a commander compared to Ender as far as gaining confidence in those around him, and why they don't really reach out to him as much. But it's a good book in general. I think it's comparable to Ender's Game as far as like the quality of it. It's definitely better than these other books here. But I think these are essential for this storyline. And that's really it. So if you have any questions, comments, anything like that, if you have any insights about reading this book or anything like that, please comment below. And please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.